It's here. It's now. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today, about to do a monologue, my second of season 15, here at Wine of the Month Club. It's a beautiful day in Southern California, Monrovia. About to embark on spring, and it's looking good for us. And I was checking out, actually, recently, the reservoir levels all throughout the state of California because of our drought situation for the previous years. And do you know that some of our reservoirs are completely full? There's only one reservoir throughout the whole state that's not at least its historical average. All the rest are either at the historical average or full of water. And so that's kind of cool to know. And that's without the snowpack melting. Anyway, Wine Talks, of course, is available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, wherever you hang out for your podcasting, and sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, now sporting the Napa and Bordeaux series of wines. Yesterday, I did a recording with Ed Massiano, one of the LA great wine critics and journalists, actually, who waxes poetic about the wine industry. And we talk history, which we've had a lot of fun, so listen to that. But today, we're going to catch up on a lot of things wine, particularly Wine of the Month Club. We're going to talk about what's going on in the industry. We're going to talk about what's going on with consumers. We're going to talk about what's going on in the wine world. I might wax a little poetic myself because I've got this new outlook on wine, it's passionate look. And I want to talk about a show I'm working on because I think you'll be excited to show. Excited is probably not a good word. I think you'll be interested to know what we're working on. So I'll tell you that story too. But I want to talk about a little bit what's some of the hot subjects. You've probably heard them on the podcast, and that would be inclusionary and diversity in the wine world. And so there's been a lot of attention paid to women in wine in the last, actually, few years. A lot of attention paid to people of color in wine, and I'll talk about some of those numbers with you today, too. It's an interesting aspect of our industry, and I have some philosophies. I have some reasons for this sort of non-attempted, actually, sort of exclusionary opinion of the world on wine. We're going to talk about the honest glass of wine, my new term that I've been coining, and I'm getting positive comments from on winemakers and people in the industry, the word honest glass of wine. We're going to talk about some of the failures in this industry when it comes to consumerism. We talked about wink once already. So let's get started. Let's talk about the inclusionary. This is very interesting to me because the wine industry in California, it was born around late 1700s, something like that. And it was born of the San Gabriel Valley and the Inland Empire, which to people that don't live here would be Ontario, sort of a little bit further south, southeast of Los Angeles, about an hour or two. It's called Cucamonga, Rancho Cucamonga now, Ontario upland. This was the birthplace of sort of the wine trade in California. And it didn't make it to Napa. In fact, Napa and Sonoma aren't really discussed much until the late 1800s. And tons of history there to talk about in a future episode. But we're going to talk a little bit about the California in general history, and Los Angeles being one. I think at some point there's an argument that there was 1 million acres under vine. A million vines in Los Angeles at one time. And so as we read through the history, we find that some of the great, like for instance, the train station, the Union Station, was covered in vines in its heyday. But the trade started around the Cucamonga area, the Inland Empire. It's rife with all kinds of controversy. It's argued that Father Junipero Serra brought the mission grape in as he made his way north in planting the missions. And then there's argument against that because at the time that he came to California, he probably the vines would have been dormant and a bad time to travel with vines. It's hard to say, but it was clear that in the late 1700s, early 1800s, up until the late 1800s, that wine was a very important industry in California, not in Northern California, strictly Southern California, and Los Angeles being the hub of that eventually. There's a wonderful book called Tangled Vines, which documents part of this. She actually documents, Frances Deaconspiel documents the improprieties of our industry, which would be fraud and murder and arson and all kinds of great stuff. But it starts with murder, and it starts with the late 1700s. The reason that she wrote this book, as a very famous wine warehouse was burned to the ground in 2005, her family lost many vintages from the 1800s of her great-grandfather's, I think, wine that was made in Cucamonga. And that started her on this quest to figure out what this was all about. So it's an interesting part of our industry that's not well known. And the wines, of course, are not what we think they are today. They were not Cabernet Sauvignon, and we worry about oak aging, and we worry about the balance of the structure and the acid. They were actually many grapes we don't grow today, Mission being one of the main grapes of early California wine. But there are others, Muscatel, grapes I've never heard of before. And the wines were more of a sherry or more of a port-like character. And so they had age to them, but they were well received throughout the country. And in fact, the idea of shipping much of it to New York and the East Coast was on the table. That was being done. And many critics at the time, or at least journalists of wine and food, or just travelers, documented how wonderful the wine was here in Southern California. So it leads me to understand or try and figure out why there would be perceived exclusionary ambiance of the wine industry. It still has that good old boys network. The inclusionary or the sexism in wine has seemed to wane a little bit. There are more women in the winemaking world. And let's face it, we've discussed this before, the women have better palates than men, actually. And if you don't know this, your palate is generally best between 9 and 11 in the morning, which is when I start tasting wine. And women do better than men with that. And so I've had many, many women on the show of different ilks of the industry. You will still find, though, a very small percentage of the executives of wine making, wineries, distribution, all the facets of wine are women. So whereas there might be 20% or 24% women in the winemaking force, there's more like 5 or 7% in the executive ranks of wine. And that's kind of interesting to me. And I have yet to explain how that would have happened, except for normal course of industry that occurred throughout America, and which is being rectified now and being dealt with. Because I don't think in the beginning, in the early days of Napa, for instance, the Mondavis, the Louis Martinis, the Brother Timothy, the Christian brothers, would necessarily want to exclude a group or groups. But I also believe that's certainly possible, and I also believe that the ambiance of wine, the sophistication, the pretension, the idea that surrounds wine, at least in the American side of things, could be off-putting for not only women but people of color and minorities as to not even venture into it. And I can see that easily. I can see that because wine is intimidating, and I don't like and can't agree when I see influencers and journalists talking about trying to mitigate the pretension to wine, trying to simplify wine for people. You can't do it. Wine is complicated, and it can be as complicated as you want it to be. The more I read, the more I don't know, like many subjects. I was reading a book on rocks the other day and the soil types, and you can get into the molecular exchange with the tap roots of a vine to explain stuff. But that doesn't explain that value of a glass of wine. It explains what's in it. It doesn't explain why it makes you feel the way you do. And we're going to talk about that too. But I don't agree with bloggers and influencers that talk about making wine simple. It's not. But it doesn't mean that somebody who's not interested in educating themselves on wine or going through classes or taking WSET or even reading about wine can't enjoy nor differentiate an honest glass of wine. And what is an honest glass of wine? I suppose that the idea of an honest glass of wine might be related to like a natural wine, which has no definition in our vernacular exactly, but it tends to want to be wines of less intervention, wines that actually are grown in the vineyard. And that's where wine starts. And that's what wine is all about, is what is that vineyard. And so not all grapes do well in all vineyards. Not all grapes do well across the world. Not all Pinot Noir grows the same as in Chile as it might in the central coast of California or New Zealand, or Burgundy for that matter. So wine, the study of wine can take you in many directions, but to understand a glass of wine really is just to appreciate that glass of wine that's in your hand, and that it has some kind of ethereal value, that it has a value to you that other than the 14% alcohol, which is certainly part of the value. But it's important to know that you don't have to study, nor do you need to be put off or intimidated by the subject of wine, because wine is for the people. It's been around for, we were talking last on the podcast with Ed Maciana, 8,000 years, and I have a book at home that I haven't started yet called 9,000 Years of Wine. And it's an interesting approach to wine, an interesting thought about wine, because grapes have yeast on their skins and they will ferment eventually, but the skin has to break. The yeast is not inside the grape, it's on the outside. So until that skin breaks and some kind of juice is in contact with the yeast, it's not going to ferment. So it requires human intervention to create wine. That's required. It doesn't create itself. So we have this approach to wine that can be extraordinarily intimidating for many, many people that are just on the periphery of wine. But that part shouldn't be. I don't think it should be. I think if we tell the stories of wine, if we talk about the history of wine, if we talk about not what's in the bottle as far as the character and swirling and sniffing and explaining you smell raspberries and cedar or whatever, because that part is the intimidating part. That is the part that people don't understand. That is the part that people will go, oh, I don't smell cedar in this. I don't smell cigar box. What do you mean it smells like Band-Aids? What kind of comment is that? So for me, it's really about telling the stories of wine and piquing the interest of a consumer because of the story at this bottle or the history of the region or the particular character that made the wine. Because the stories of wine are about the people that make it. And so an honest glass of wine represents that. That's what I'm trying to get to. It represents not only the soil, the terroir, which is, the whole growing conditions, et cetera, in that vintage, because as Mike Salacci on the show said, the winemaker at Opus, as most will say, that wine is to be a sense of time and a sense of place. So here's who we are and when we were. And what other product does that? None of it. I mean, no other product. I suppose you could take a tape recorder from the 70s, the reel to reel, and say, well, this is what we were, and this is how we sounded, but there's no ethereal value to that, right? So here we have a glass of wine, and we can taste this history. And I have this huge belief, and being able to articulate this better with winemakers and proprietors of famed chateau and families that have been in this industry for a long time, and it's starting to surface this articulation of this idea, which is, wouldn't the years, hundreds of years in those regions that have had growing wine for that long, wouldn't today's winemakers be a rolled up expression? The wines that are being made honestly, again, that word honest, wouldn't those wines be a representation of these years and years and years of experience in history and storytelling rolled up into the next person's methodology for making wine? I believe they would. I believe everything, maybe subliminally, maybe quietly, maybe the stories don't mean anything to the child that's being told the stories, but when that man or woman becomes a winemaker, the influence of those stories will influence what they put in the bottle. And so I'm not going to point to a character or a streak of acid or some kind of fruit flavor that we find in a glass of wine as a representation of this experience. No, it's that feeling, that unexplained, unarticulable feeling that you get from the proper glass of wine or an honest glass of wine. And so I have this idea to tell those stories. And I've read enough stories, and I've read enough, after 300 podcasts, and hearing the stories of these people and hearing the history of wine and hearing the comments, even the swirling and sniffing comments, that there's so much to tell that would lead a consumer to have this piqued interest to understand more and to taste more and to realize there's more than just Apothic Red and 19 Crimes and all the shelf items that we see. And so I think, this part's going to get kind of dicey because I think it's important to have those kinds of wines. White Zinfandel in the 70s was an important part of bringing people to the table to drink wine that didn't before. But I want to at least tell the story so that when somebody does go to the store, that maybe their mind has changed. Maybe they seek something else to try. Maybe they ask a question of the store manager or the department manager at the supermarket, or they walk to a local wine shop instead of going to the supermarket to buy wine. And I was going to have today's podcast actually was going to be with Dan Berger. We'll bring him back later, one of the great wine critics and journalists of our time, to talk about the earlier days of wine journalism and wine critiquing and talk about how it's changed. I think it's important to discuss that. We won't discuss it now. But I think we want to tell the story. So I am starting to pitch a TV show. And it's much like Down the Road of Parts Unknown by Anthony Bourdain. And in fact, I have one of Anthony Bourdain's producers on my team to get the point across, to see if we can get somebody to pick up the idea of these stories, to tell these stories about wine. I'll tell you one of them. I think we discussed it with the Cladstrups. If you have not heard the podcast with the Cladstrups, who wrote the book Wine and War, you must listen to the podcast. It will pique your interest to get the book and read the stories. But there's one particular story of Monsieur Huet, which is an incredible story. He's from the Loire. And he was at Calais during the war, which was just south of Dunkirk. And of course, the movie Dunkirk documents and explains how Hitler actually made a bad decision and did not annihilate the English as their backs were against the English Channel, and the boats from England came and saved the English army, while the Germans had surrounded them. What they don't talk about is Calais, just south of Dunkirk, where the French were, and there was no chance. There was no boats coming, and so they were all taken to prisoner of war camps. So if you've never seen the movie Stalag 17 with William Holden, it's black and white, so many of you may not have. You've certainly heard of Hogan's Heroes with Colonel Klink, and the movie The Great Escape with Steve McQueen and all the famed actors. So this one story, it's a real story. It's part Stalag 17, it's part The Great Escape, and it's part Hogan's Heroes. And it's hard to imagine that, a sitcom from the 70s or 60s has anything to do with a wine story. But in reality, the French lieutenant or captain that was taken at Calais, who went to the POW camp for French officers, was able to literally dupe, extort, blackmail the commandant of the Offlog 4, as it was, to let them hold a wine tasting for the POWs. And there were 4,000 POWs. So that part is Hogan's Heroes. The commandant literally said, I don't want to deal with the Gestapo. This is, it's not my thing. I just want to get through this war kind of thing, just like Colonel Klink. And so he allowed the prisoners to put on this tasting for 4,000 prisoners, which took 3 days. Obviously, there aren't too many tables long enough to seat 4,000 prisoners at once. So they start out in an attempt through the families of the men that were in this concentration camp to get wines sent to the Stalag with the behest of the commandant, and start to procure wine so they could pour off what ended up being like an ounce or two of wine for each POW. But in the meantime, there was a group in the camp that was digging a tunnel. And much like the movie The Great Escape, where the prisoners were using wood planks that were supports for the beds to shore up the tunnel, this group of prisoners needed an excuse to explain to the Nazis why wood was missing. So they asked this French lieutenant if they could build them a prop wine press with wood staves as part of the props for the stage show that they were going to have during this tasting. And this gave the prisoners who dig in the tunnel an excuse to show the Nazis where the wood was going, when in reality it was going to shore up the tunnel. And during this tasting, 5 men escaped through that tunnel, much like the movie The Great Escape. So these kinds of stories, particularly in this case, Monsieur Huet, who actually his family had a winery in the Loire, and they're making Chenin Blanc and Vouvray. You have to believe that back against the wall, that risk, that experience, that struggle, all of those things that occurred during those 4 years that he was in camp has to roll up into what you're tasting. Has to. Those experiences have to influence what you think and how you do things, and it comes out in a glass of wine. That's my opinion. And not everybody gets a chance to hear those stories. Not everybody gets a chance to read those stories. And so I think we can bring those stories to life through contemporary means of storytelling, social, streaming. We're going to check all the platforms and all the different people that do this to see if we can get traction. And it's going to be much like Parts Unknown by Anthony Bourdain, where we're telling the stories. We're talking to the people. We're not swirling. We're not sniffing. We're not pontificating. We're not talking about credentials in the wine industry. We're talking about real people and real stories. So we'll keep you posted on that. One thing I want to talk about too before we get off here is the behind the scenes activity in our wine world. The direct-to-consumer side of wine, which is what we do here at Wine of the Month Club, has gone through some amazing transformations and changes during COVID and post-COVID. During COVID, people, weren't spending money on travel. They weren't spending money on eating out. They weren't spending money on anything. And so everybody in our industry, the sales volume went up, and the quality of wine that we were selling went up. In other words, people were willing to spend more money on a bottle of wine than they were under normal circumstances, because wine is not a necessity. It might be around my house or your house, but in the most part, for most people, wine is not a necessity. It will be something that would be pared back or pulled back a little bit during times of economic strife and or even a recession, as we were possibly getting into. So people have to look at wine as a sort of a luxury. And I don't mean luxury like, Cartier jewelry. I just mean luxury as something on the periphery that we spend our money on. And that means a luxury could be a $7 bottle of wine or a $100 bottle of wine. It doesn't matter. It's still a luxury to the person that can afford whatever they can afford. And so during COVID, it was great. And then post-COVID has been a nightmare in the sense of we don't understand what people are doing. The people that were buying on the internet during COVID are not buying on the internet today. Now, there's some very loyal customers at certain places, certain wineries. You may belong to a club for a winery because you like that winemaker's work or that winery's history. That's great. But in general, I'm talking about in general, the direct-to-consumer world of wine is in a tizzy. It's going to come back. People are going to understand that. And the reason it's in a tizzy is a couple of things. One, I explained the economic issues with wine, but it's also because there's bad taste in the world of wine because of the crap that's been coming into America, because the business school model has been applied to the wine industry. And because I go back to the idea that wine is an emotional product and it actually should be telling you a story, if the wines that are not telling you a story, the wines that don't make you feel something, that are being bottled up by these large logistic companies, pumping as much wine into the system as they can, and then you take it home with this nice package and you realize that the wine's not nearly as good as the design of the label or the glass thickness that the bottle is. This is what happens. And so there's been a lot of this crap wine coming into the marketplace, bottled in pretty packages, sold on the internet through Groupon, etc. Consumers buy it and they get a bad taste. And so now they're reluctant to do it again. They're reluctant to buy wine because wine is not a widget. I mean, if you're going to buy wine from Europe and bring it over in 20,000 liter containers and bottle it up, and try to express it as something good, eventually the public's going to catch up with you. And that's what I believe is part of our situation today. The public is caught up with it. We want honest wine. I want an honest glass of wine. And so as soon as that settles down, and there'll be more implosions as the Wink story, which I talked about before, in this industry coming up. There'll be more. If they're not more implosions or more companies actually just failing outright, they'll be bought up by companies that do it right, convert those customers to understand they're doing it right and getting good wines, and that'll change the minds of a lot of people that are buying wine on the internet. There are some people out there that are touting new packaging. There are people out there touting Tetra Paks. There are people out there touting synthetic corks, screw caps. All of those, in my opinion, are strictly, as my old architect would say, sex for the box office. Because what's in that bottle is still the most important part. And you can't bamboozle that. It's like buying a cheap foreign-made, I guess you can't really say that anymore, but just a cheap version of a product versus a quality one. That cheap version is going to fail on you eventually. Maybe it doesn't even work when you bring it out of the box. Some of the stuff I buy on Facebook, it looks so good on Facebook, but when you get it, you kind of go, that didn't work out so well. A couple of them are pretty good, though. Flashlight I got recently was pretty good. But that's why you understand what I'm saying, that if the manufacturing costs of wine, because it goes back to how much you pay for the land. Well, better land costs more. It goes back to what you pay for the rootstock. Better rootstock costs more. Better clones cost more of grapes. Harvesting grapes or planting them in a place that requires hand harvesting versus machine. All the things that roll up into what happens when you manufacture wine, and what happens to that wine if you continue to reduce the costs of that manufacturing will affect the wine. Back to my story, full circle, about an honest glass of wine. A glass of wine that represents its time and its place by the winemaker and the proprietors. So you will end up with cheap wine. You'll buy it. We're all going to try it. We're all going to be disappointed, and we're all going to say, I'm not doing that again. And I always think that all generations, whether it's my generation as a baby boomer or millennials or Gen Z or LMNOP or whatever letter we're on, eventually will land on the proper glass of wine or an honest glass of wine for the ages. It's like Ed says the other day, it's 8,000 years old. It's 9,000 years old. It's not going anywhere. It will fluctuate and it will go through contemporary changes. Profiles of what people are drinking will change. But nothing's really changed. I mean, it's still fermented grape juice. You still plant it, and you still put yeast in it, and all the things we do, inoculated yeast from the catalog, or whether it's natural yeast, or whether we put a screw cap in it, or we put a synthetic cork or a real cork, all of that is periphery. It has to come down to what's in that bottle, what the juice actually tastes like. And I hope that you guys that listen to this show have this passion about something in your life, not just wine. I have it for wine, which is what I do. And so when I come home from work, and I've discussed this before, I kind of figure out what I feel like drinking first before I decide what to cook. Hopefully I have in the kitchen something that pairs well. But it still starts with, what do I have to drink and what do I feel like drinking? I don't always feel like a Cabernet from Napa. I don't always feel like a Bordeaux. I don't always feel like a lighthearted Burgundy. I don't always feel like a complex Burgundy. I don't always feel like an interesting grape from another part of the world. But I do feel about having something else sometimes. So last night, I felt like Burgundy, and I felt like I didn't need to open something fancy. I just wanted that wonderful fruit character and the way it makes me feel. When I hold that bottle, I look at it, I go, oh, wow, look at this. This is Louis Jadot, Côte de Beaune Burgundy. What's the story? I feel like I'm somewhere else. I don't feel like I'm in the supermarket, grabbing a bottle of 19 crimes, like my joke is. The only crime is they put it in the bottle. I love that joke. So there's going to be changes on our industry. There's going to be consolidations. You're going to see different companies. You're going to see efforts to improve what comes in the mail on a wine side and the information that goes with it. Because what's happened also on the other side, this part's a little too businesslike for this conversation, but I want to tell you a little bit about it, is the wholesale side, where we buy our wines from. And the Wine of the Month Club, we buy them from all over the place. I mean, we buy them in every state that you can buy a wine, not state like the United States, but state of the wine itself, whether it's fermented, unfermented grapes, or in the bottle or whatever. We've done it all here. And because of COVID, and because of the effort it takes, and because wine is a difficult industry to be in as far as selling stuff, there's been a lot of consolidation in the wholesale side. What does that mean to you? Not much, really, when it comes to the business side. But what it does mean is what's on the shelf when you go to the store. Because wine is becoming much like toothpaste and salad dressing. It's going to be very difficult to compete with Newman's Own or Kraft or Wishbone or Crest or Colgate. Impossible, right? So shelf space at the market is being sucked in by the big brands, the big players, the guys with the money. They're the ones that get the shelf space. They're the ones that are basically guiding you to buy their things because that's all there is. And so the more, and what's happening is as smaller wholesalers get absorbed by the big guys, and their wholesale catalog, what we call the book, starts to get thicker and thicker and thicker. And all of a sudden, these wonderful wines that are buried in this book aren't getting any attention because there's not enough salespeople to go pitch them, and they just sit there. And ultimately, the consumer is the one that gets stiffed because we don't have access to the wines, and we have to dig a little deeper and go to different places to do it. And so that's what's happening. Again, it's rhythmic. Things change in this industry all the time, but it's important to understand why when you go to Ralph's or Safeway or Kroger's or whatever part of the country you're in and what markets you go to, that it looks like all the wines are the same. And so I encourage you to go to a wine shop. And in many states, alcohol is protected from supermarket chains being able to sell it. And I think that's a great, the more I think about that, the more how great it is for the consumer for that to be the case. Because by nature, you're going to have more interesting wines. It's just the way they work. So, hey, more to come on all of this. I'm glad I had a chance to sit with you folks and talk a little bit about things that are going on. I'm really excited about what we call Through the Grapevine. That's one name for the show that we're talking about. Or No Sniffing and No Swirling. Like Anthony Bourdain had no reservations. And I'm talking about no sniffing, no swirling. We're not doing that. Or Through the Grapevine, which are stories that occurred throughout history regarding wine and the regions of wine. So cheers. Hope that we get to meet soon again and look for more great podcasts coming up. We have some great guests. I'm headed to Napa soon to do a handful of really, really special interviews with some great people. It's interesting for me because now we've got such traction and such interesting guests that we're being sought out by wineries and PR firms to host their winemakers and proprietors on the show. So look for more of those. Cheers, and just have fun out there in the world of wine. As Ed said the other day, you don't have to like it. You don't have to put that nose to your glass and say, this is great. If you don't like it, you don't like it. And find something you do. Cheers. Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Callum-Carrion. Don't forget to subscribe because there's more great interviews on their way. And of course, all these podcasts are sponsored by the original Wine of the Month Club, 48 years in business. Don't forget to visit our website, wineofthemonthclub.com. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.